This presentation was originally given live at the Nashville Lawn and Garden Show in 2005. I have recorded narration to accompany my PowerPoint slides so that this lecture can be made available online for educational purposes. Welcome to this lecture on historic landscape preservation. My name is Steve Garrett. I am the founder, president, and horticulturist at Brentwood Landscapes, a landscape firm serving the metro Nashville area since 1999. I have been invited to speak today on the subject of historic landscape preservation. And in the spirit of complete disclosure, I must say that I am not a specialist in historic preservation. I am by education a plant scientist and by experience a landscaping entrepreneur. But my interest in history, especially the history of Middle Tennessee, where I have spent much of my life, has led me to study this particular field from an academic and business point of view. Much of my earlier learning in landscape preservation came from a 2-week program of study I engaged in, sponsored by the Historic Landscape Institute of Monticello, entitled Preserving Jefferson's Gardens and Landscapes. Many of the photos in my presentations were taken during this program of study. With our introduction complete, let's get going. I want to begin by drawing your attention to these 3 photos and ask the question, what do these 3 sites have in common? The photo on the left is of a homestead farmer's dugout near Dexter, New Mexico, which was built in 1902. The middle photo is of the gravesite of our 4th president, James Madison, who died in 1836 at his home in Virginia, Montpelier. The photo on the right is of the rotunda at the University of Virginia, designed by our 3rd president, Thomas Jefferson, and built in 1817. What these 3 sites have in common is that in their own way, each one has some sort of historical significance. The historical significance of some places is obvious, like the battlefield of Gettysburg, for instance. But the historical significance of other places may not be as obvious. Why is it important to understand landscapes from a historical perspective? Just like people, a landscape has a story to tell. Landscapes can, first of all, tell us about historic advances in landscape architecture or design. For those of you in design, learning more about how to preserve these sites would be a particular benefit. Secondly, landscapes can help tell the story of certain important events or people. Visiting the historic home of one of our presidents can help us learn more about them and how the environment in which they lived may have affected their political philosophy. And thirdly, landscapes can help tell the story of the development of our culture and society. The westward movement of our nation across the continent was a major historical event that affects not only our nation as a whole, but some of us very personally. We will discuss this more later. But here's an important thing to note. Landscapes cannot tell their story if they are gone. Thousands of acres of land are developed every year in the United States. Those of us in the landscaping industry know this very well. It is therefore important that significant landscape sites be preserved for those of us living here today and for future generations to come. As a landscaper, I feel a special connection to the land with which I work almost every day in some capacity or another. Most of our green industry is concerned with progress, not preservation. The land is stripped and reformatted to fit the needs of the current inhabitants. This is the way it has always been. But if we completely obliterate the past, we lose part of who we are today. The depth of the image we have of this world and our place in it is lessened. This presentation is designed to create awareness among landscape architects, landscapers, horticulturists, and gardeners about the importance of historic landscape preservation. I also want to introduce you to some of the fascinating methods that are used in the field of historic landscape preservation. Historic landscapes and their preservation is a broad field of interest that perhaps many of you can connect with. Landscape designers and architects might be interested in trends in landscape design through the centuries and how to apply these principles to contemporary projects. Horticulturists and gardeners may be interested in heirloom plants of a specific time frame and where to obtain them. Growers and nurseries may be interested in propagating heirloom plants from seed or grafting. And maintenance firms could be interested in how to develop specific grounds maintenance plans and techniques to better manage historically significant landscapes. As we proceed through our presentation today, I would suggest that you think about how you, as a professional, might be able to incorporate some aspects of historic landscape preservation into your particular field. With that said, let's turn our attention to the three areas I previously mentioned regarding the story the landscape has to tell. I will begin each section by first reading to you from the Secretary of the Interior's Guidelines, Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. Keep in mind that the U.S. Department of the Interior is the federal agency in charge of placing properties on the National Register of Historic Places, and the National Park Service has the responsibility of managing our national historic landmarks. You can learn a great deal more about this at their website, nps.gov. So in our first section, we will look at advances in landscape design. According to the Secretary of the Interior, a historic designed landscape is a landscape that was consciously designed or laid out by a landscape architect, master gardener, architect, engineer, or horticulturist according to design principles, or an amateur gardener working in a recognized style or tradition. The landscape may be associated with a significant person, trend, or event in landscape architecture, or illustrate an important development in the theory and practice of landscape architecture. Examples would include parks, campuses, and estates. Let's look at some examples. As I mentioned previously, I spent 2 weeks attending the Historic Landscape Institute in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 2002. This was a great learning experience for me, and it really opened my eyes to the field of historic landscape preservation. This is a collaborative program between the University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson in 1817, and Jefferson's home, Monticello. Jefferson was a unique man in many ways. Most of us know about him from history as the writer of the Declaration of Independence and our third president. But Jefferson also studied horticulture and architecture. As a student of philosophy, he greatly admired ancient Greek and Roman classical architecture. He was also affected by what we call rationalism, and his landscape designs for both the university and his home are very rational. As Jefferson developed his plans for the first state university of Virginia, he wrote to Governor Wilson C. Nicholas in 1816 that the small buildings of a village provide the opportunity to exhibit models in architecture of the purest forms of antiquity, furnishing to the students examples of the precepts he will be taught in that art. So in this slide we see the Rotunda, which was based upon the Pantheon in Rome, built in 127 AD. The Rotunda is the central building of Jefferson's plan for the university and sits at one end of the main lawn. Jefferson intended this building to be a place for assemblies and a library. He also envisioned a sort of planetarium for the top floor. And you might also see a resemblance in this structure to his own home, Monticello. Flanking both sides of the lawn are the dwellings for faculty and students. Jefferson's intention was that there be a close mentor-like relationship between students and teachers. And this original section of the campus is called the Academic Village. Faculty would live in the pavilions and the students in the range, basically the dorm rooms that connect the pavilions. While I was attending the Historic Landscape Institute, I stayed in one of these 200-year-old rooms. And I couldn't help but think about all of the students who had studied in that room over the years and who then left the university to put their own stamp on the world. This particular pavilion in the center of the photo is pavilion number 4. Here's another slide showing a different pavilion, pavilion number 3. And as we look at these slides, notice how the landscape, both the lawn and plantings, are used by Jefferson from both a practical and an aesthetic way. This slide shows you the layout map of the academic village. You see the rotunda at the right end in this photo of the lawn, and the faculty pavilions and the adjoining ranges on either side of the lawn. And while we have this slide, also look at the areas behind the pavilions and ranges, extending away from the lawn on both sides. These are the gardens. Each pavilion has a garden behind it. At the end of the garden are support structures. The gardens are enclosed by serpentine brick walls whose curve helps stabilize them. And remarkably, these walls are only 1 brick thick. Again, we see the incorporation of architecture and landscape. The Garden Club of Virginia restored these gardens between 1948 and 1963, incorporating concepts and plants that would have been familiar to Jefferson. This is a photo looking towards the back of Pavilion 9. Hence, the garden in this area is called Garden 9. The central path leading up to the back door is lined with apple trees. Here's a photo of Garden 7, looking down from the back porch of Pavilion 7. Here we have another view of Garden 7. The large flowering plants in the center are oak leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea quercifolia. Because this is a public college campus, the lawn is kept mowed. However, it would not have looked like this during Jefferson's day, as the lawnmower as we know it had not yet been invented. More than likely, a scythe would have been used several times a year to keep the lawn manageable. But these are issues historical preservationists must deal with: the level of authenticity desired versus practical aspects of the current use of the space. Obviously, in a college campus, it would not be practicable to have areas with grass up to your knees. This is a photo of the garden gate leading out of the back of the garden. Notice the ball and chain hanging from the gate. This is called a cannonball gate closer, a device which helped keep the gate closed. Though in use during Jefferson's time, you can find these for sale today online. A one-time student at the University of Virginia was Edgar Allan Poe, who attended the university from February through December 1826. Here you see the plaque placed above his dorm room. There are some things that make a place historic, besides old buildings and landscapes, which actually is going to lead us to our second section of our lecture today. Historic landscapes have a story to tell about important events or persons. According to the Secretary of the Interior, a historic site is a landscape significant for its association with a historic event, activity, or person. Examples could include battlefields, presidential homes, and other properties. One of the historic sites I was able to visit for the first time was Montpelier, the home of our 4th president, James Madison. The first thing you have probably noticed already about this photo is the pink color of the house. Montpelier is a great example of what can happen with historical properties when the current owners sell the house and new owners move in and change it for their needs. This happened with Montpelier several times after President Madison's wife, Dolly, sold the estate in 1844 when she moved back to Washington, D.C. The home changed owners several times and was eventually purchased by William DuPont in 1901, who would turn much of the grounds into an equestrian center. In 1983, the DuPont heirs gave the estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Notice in this photo that I took in 2002, the two-story wings on either side of the main section of the house, and also notice the landscape plants directly in front of the house. In this after restoration photo, which I did not take, you can see that the wings and the pink stucco have been removed, and the house is now as it was during Madison's time. I also draw your attention to the mowing stripes on the lawn. Similar to maintaining the lawn at the University of Virginia, the historic preservationist had to make a decision regarding the current use of the property and the economic costs of maintaining the turf in the way it would have been done in the early 1800s. Using modern mowing machinery is the practical solution. However, it might be possible for them to mow the lawn in a less precise fashion than you see in this aerial photograph. In this, another after restoration photo, which I did not take, notice the absence of any foundation plantings, as this type of landscaping was not done until a much later period. There are restored formal gardens, however, around the house. They were designed under the direction of Rudy Favaretti. Here we have the entry gate with marble inlay. The photo next to it is of a planting border consisting of oak leaf hydrangea and a variety of spirea and large boxwood. There is behind this planting a specimen Magnolia virginiana. And the hydrangea can take full sun and some shade. The spirea are really a full sun selection. Another view of the formal garden. Again, boxwood forms the background with a full sun perennial planting in front. And in the right picture, we see statuary. This would have been a common type of ornamentation in a formal garden at the period of Madison. Another view of Montpelier's formal garden. The boxwood hedge on the right looks rather brown on top because it has been severely pruned for restoration purposes. Now in this slide we see the temple on the left and a very large cedar on the right. Both of these date to Madison's period and would have been actual design elements in the overall landscaping of the grounds. The temple itself actually covers the ice house, so it was kind of a good use. Using temples, classical structures like this, like having just one of these on a property, was part of the period landscaping design. Also on the property, as you see in this slide, is a very old cedar of Lebanon tree. The view on the left shows some of the pruning cuts that have been made to it over time. The photo on the right kind of gives you a certain sense of scale when you see how tall it is compared to that person. Excavations are taking place at Montpelier when I was there. This one is an excavation of a foundation of a former house that burned in 1770. This slide shows the presidential grave of James Madison. Madison grew up at Montpelier. He lived there his whole adult life, except when he was in the White House, and he died there. And both he and First Lady Dolly Madison are buried there on site. Now this photo is of a lesser well-known Thomas Jefferson house designed by Jefferson, known as Poplar Forest. Poplar Forest was built in 1806 according to Jefferson's design, and it was his retreat from Monticello. Jefferson used Poplar Forest as a working plantation to earn additional income. The design of the house is octagonal in shape, perhaps the first house built of that shape in America. And also in this photo you see on the left they're doing some restoration work, and the large boxwoods that surround the entry drive here, very large specimens. Again, at Poplar Forest, this is an archaeological dig which was being undertaken in an effort to locate the original road or drive leading up to the house. A layer of cobblestone was unearthed, as seen on the right. In the photo on the left, you see they have dug a hole. This hole was the location of a tree. They excavated this exact spot because they had observed a dark area in the soil, and this is where the carbon from a long-gone plant had stained the soil. This is quite literally a carbon footprint. By comparing written records with archaeological work, the layout of the landscape during a previous period can be discovered. This is another plantation off the beaten path called Bremo. Bremo was developed by John Cock between 1808 and 1819, a well-known early American family. Bremo plantation consists of 3 houses: Upper Bremo, which is the mansion in this photo, Lower Bremo, and the recess. The house is built in the side of a hill overlooking the James River. This is the side of the house that is not facing the river. This is the back elevation, the side facing the river. Notice how the long wings are visible from the back, but they were not visible at all from the front. This was a particularly used design technique that Jefferson liked. And the builder who helped build Bremo had also worked on Monticello. In this slide we see a detailed site plan that has been put together. This would be used by historic landscape preservationists to catalog, first of all of the features on the property as it actually is now. And then as the property undergoes renovation, details can be added to it. On site here at Upper Bremo is the stone barn. So no expense was spared when this plantation was built. There is actually in the steeple of this barn a bell. The bell is 600 years old. It was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette to the Koch family. And when my tour group went in, each one of us was allowed to ring the bell, which I thought was pretty cool. This slide shows the classical structure that is on the site of Bremo, the Temple of Temperance, it is called. So just like Montpelier had the temple, a classical temple, so does Bremo as part of the overall grounds design. In this slide we have the front elevation of the other house on the property known as Lower Bremo. And in this slide we see the side elevation of Lower Bremo and the gardens next to it. In this slide you see the back elevation of Lower Bremo. It may be difficult to tell, but the house actually sits below grade in the back, almost a full story. The large green plants on the back wall are climbing hydrangea. I fell in love with climbing hydrangea on this trip, and when I got home, I started using it in all of my designs. It's a good alternative to English ivy, not nearly so invasive, plus it flowers in the summer. However, I don't recommend planting it in full sun. Eastern or northern exposure would be best. One of the benefits of visiting places like this is that it exposes us to plants or design elements and ideas that we're not used to and helps us grow in our plant palette. This is the recess. The recess was actually the first house John Cocke built on his plantation. Here are the grounds of Bremo, at least as they appeared in 2002. Bremo at that time had not been historically restored as far as the grounds go. Here you see an old boxwood garden. A lot of it had been pruned, so it probably was in the process of being restored. This garden is actually at the recess. And this is an interesting picture. Here you see cedar trees growing from the stumps of their predecessors. For some reason, the original tree had to be cut down, and the root system was tough enough to grow back a new top. Like Montpelier and Poplar Forest, we need to remember that it was slave labor that built and maintained the Bremo plantation. Fortunately, many of these historic sites are not only preserving the history of architecture and gardens, but they're also preserving the story of the people who lived there, which included slavery and the story of slavery in the United States. So by preserving the historic landscapes on which these slaves lived and worked, we're also preserving an important part of our nation's history. And this leads us to our third category of historical significance. Historic landscapes have a story to tell about important places, important events, and important people. But our landscapes also tell us a story about ourselves, our communities, and our culture. In this respect, we're referring to what is called, according to the Secretary of the Interior, a historic vernacular landscape, which is a landscape that evolved through use by the people whose activities or occupancy shaped it, through social or cultural attitudes of an individual, a family, or a community. The landscape reflects the physical, biological, and cultural character of everyday lives. Function plays a significant role in vernacular landscapes. This can be a farm complex or historic homesteads along a river valley. Examples would include historic districts and even agricultural landscapes, such as farms. My great-grandparents were Duncan and Hattie McVicker. They moved from Texas to the New Mexico Territory in 1902 to settle a homestead in Chavez County, near present-day Dexter. In 2002, I had the pleasure to attend a family reunion. As part of the reunion, our family ventured to visit the homestead site that had been settled at that time 100 years earlier. There were no roads leading to the exact spot where the house was, but with permission of the property owners, we literally drove over barren land right up to the location. In addition to farming, my great-grandfather was a builder of sorts, and one of the things he built was cisterns. This photo is of the cistern that he built in 1902 at their homestead. It is such a strange feeling for me to see this actual well that was built by my great-grandfather 100 years ago. It's still there, and it's dry as a bone, which helps explain why they eventually moved off the farm into Dexter, where my grandmother was born. The water supply that was at the homestead, which included a small lake, disappeared when a dry spell happened, and apparently the water never came back. So the historical significance of this landscape lies in its ability to tell the story of what life was like for many homesteaders. The land was free, but you got what you paid for. Fortunately, my great-grandparents were able to stay there long enough to have the land deeded over to them. Now, this next slide shows the remnants of the house my great-grandparents and their 6 children inhabited. It was called a dugout because it was built into the side of a hillock. The dugout had a door in the front, a window on each side, and a fireplace in the back dug into the hill. A few feet of stone on top of the existing land, which would have probably had some plaster put over it, completed the walls, and a tin roof would have been put over the top. On this next slide, I put a yellow line on the slide so that you can get a better understanding of the dimensions of the home. The McVickers, my great-grandparents, had a total of 12 children, one of which was born in the dugout. I spent a lot of time with my great aunts and uncles who grew up through these conditions. For me, what's interesting is that all of them were so successful in life. Several of them became very wealthy, and it was all due to their own hard work. They certainly inherited nothing from their parents. And I have drawn the conclusion that the harsh landscape of the homesteader in New Mexico could have been a factor responsible for the building of their character, which led them to succeed later in life. So again, the landscape is helping to tell us a story. Now here I am, a great-grandson of Duncan and Hattie McVicker, standing in front of the dugout in 2002 with my children, who would be Duncan and Hattie's great-great-grandchildren. And just take a moment and notice not only the dimensions of that dugout, but just the landscape itself, how barren it is at this time. Another remaining physical landmark from the old homestead is the remainder of a corral fence that is seen in this photo. That's my son in the background, standing on the stone base of the fence. In case it's hard for you to see, I outlined the remains of the fence in this slide. Now, my great-grandparents eventually sold their homestead, but they retained the mineral rights. The mineral rights have been passed down from the 12 original children of the McVickers to their children and to their children's children. I myself currently have partial ownership to the mineral rights. And maybe one day oil will be discovered and the decision to not sell the mineral rights will pay off for future generations. Our time is just about up, and I'm going to end this presentation with a brief discussion on researching historical landscapes. This will, by necessity, just barely scratch the surface, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of what tools may be available to you in case you want to do some digging in the past about a certain landscape site. The first tool is written records. Written records include many things like diaries, journals, letters, travel accounts, scrapbooks, newspapers, account ledgers, catalogs, and civic records. Now we see in this next slide, this is an actual excerpt from a letter written by my great-grandmother, Hattie McVicker, to her father, who was my great-great-grandfather, J.N. Harlow, in May of 1903, about 6 months after arriving in New Mexico. Hattie writes, "Well, Papa, we have been awful busy trying to get crops all planted. It has been raining here some. Everything is awful late here. We haven't any garden to eat yet. This country is on a boom. These artesian wells is taking this people in. It will be hard for us this year, but I think after this year we can have easier and better than we ever have before. People that has been here 2 or 3 years and longer is all right. They are better to put on their tables than I ever had at Christmas at times. There is all kinds of fruit grown here and all kinds of vegetables." So we learned several things from this letter from Hattie to her father about what the country was like, what farming was being done, and the types of weather they were having. And these kinds of written records can help us put things together so that we can learn more about the historic nature of the landscape. Another research tool is archaeology. Now, archaeology includes digs, as we've seen several photos today. Excavation can involve the use of penetrating ground radar, metal detectors, and geographic information systems, or GIS. Now, this is a photo from Poplar Forest. We saw some others from that site previously. This is a close-up of the dig, Jefferson's plantation. And what I see from this picture, and we can take away, is how detailed and careful archaeologists must be as they are peeling back the layers of history that are hidden in the earth. Another tool is technology. Technology includes things such as chemical analysis, the study of weather patterns, soil core samples, marks in the soil, aerial photographs, to name just a few. So I had mentioned earlier in that slide where we saw a hole had been dug into an archaeological excavation where a tree had once been. And in this photo, you can actually see the carbon marks in the soil much better. The excavation has led down to a certain layer, and they started to notice the dark markings in the soil, and this is the actual carbon footprint. So archaeology and chemistry, can work together to help solve the puzzles from the past. And in this particular diagram, we also see another way of reading the landscape is by simply looking at visible site features that are there even today. Sometimes what we see above ground is affected by what's under the ground. I'm sure all of you who are landscapers know that quite well. As this diagram shows, an underground remnant of a wall could lead to less plant growth directly above that wall due to the effect it would have on the plant's root system, the availability of water and the like. But the diagram also shows an underground structure to the far right could create sort of a little bowl effect, and the plant might actually grow larger there because there's additional moisture or the soil might be richer in nature. So by looking at oddities in the landscape, reading the landscapes, being very specific about what we see can help give us an understanding of what the land might have looked like in the past, and it also might tell an archaeologist, here's a point where you want to start doing an excavation. And finally, another tool for the landscape historian is graphic records. Graphic records would include old photographs, prints, drawings, sketches, maps, or even paintings. This slide shows several photographs of the McVicker family. These photos were taken between 1910 and 1941. The upper left photo is the gravesite of my great-grandfather, Duncan McVicker, in 1941. I believe, on the day of his funeral. The lower left is again my great-grandfather Duncan McVicker with his oldest son Fred engaging in plastering work. And on the right is a picture of my great-grandfather in an undated photo. So by looking at these types of graphic records, we can learn certain things about our past and about the history of the land. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation on historic landscape preservation. Whether you are a landscape architect or designer, a landscape contractor, or a grounds maintenance service, I hope that this lecture may inspire you to look at the earth, which provides us with our living, a little differently. Perhaps if we stop and listen carefully, we might just learn a lesson from the past which will enrich our lives today.